I can remember seeing my paternal grandfather once, when I was about 3 years of age. All I know of him is that he was said to be the best turner in the pottery trade. This statement may have been true, or my grandfather may have been merely a fine turner, upraised by family pride into the finest. He was a superior working man, intensely respectable. He died young. My paternal grandmother died before I first saw the smoke of the Potteries.
From the card. Edward Henry Machin first saw the smoke on the 27th of May, 1867, in Broome Street, Bursley, the most ancient of the 5 towns. Broome Street runs down from St. Luke's Square straight into the Shropshire Union Canal, and consists partly of buildings known as pot banks, until they come to be sold by auction, when auctioneers describe them as extensive earthenware manufactories, and partly of cottages, whose highest rent is 4 and 6 a week. In such surroundings was an extraordinary man born. He was the only anxiety of a widowed mother, who gained her livelihood and his by making up ladies' own materials in ladies' own houses. Mrs. Machin, however, had a speciality apart from her vocation. She could wash flannel with less shrinking than any other woman in the district, and she could wash fine lace without ruining it. Thus often she came to sew, and remained to wash. A somewhat gloomy woman, thin, with a tongue, but I liked her. She saved a certain amount of time every day by addressing her son as Denry, instead of Edward Henry.
My grandfather had 2 sons and a daughter. The elder son was a pottery painter. The potteries being too small for him, he went to London to a cottage in Lambeth. He exhibited a pottery painting in his window. Sir Henry Dalton, strolling that way, saw it and engaged the artist for his Lambeth works. His younger brother, my father, began and failed as a pottery manufacturer. Then he took to pawnbroking and cared not for it. My dealings with literature go back, I suppose, some 33 years to that pawnbroker's shop. We came together thus, literature and I. It was in a kitchen at midday, and I was waiting for my dinner, hungry and clean in a tartan frock with a pinafore over it. I'd washed my own face and dried it, and I remembered that my eyes smarted with lingering soap, and my skin was drawn by the evaporation of moisture on a cold day. I held in my hand a single leaf which had escaped from a printed book. How it came into that chubby fist I cannot recall. The reminiscence begins with it already there. I gazed hard at the paper, and pretended with all my powers to be completely absorbed in its contents. I pretended to ignore someone who was rattling saucepans at the kitchen range. On my left, a very long and mysterious passage led to the pawnshop, all full of black bundles. I heard my brother crying at the other end of the passage, and his noisy naughtiness offended me. For myself, I felt excessively good with my paper. Never since have I been so filled with the sense of perfect righteousness. Here was I, clean, quiet, sedate, studious, and there was my brother, the illiterate young hooligan, disturbing the sacrosanct shop, and, what was worse, ignorant of his inferiority to me. Disgusted with him, I passed through the kitchen into another shop on the right, still conning the passage with soapy, smarting eyes. At this point, the light of memory is switched off. The printed matter, which sprang out of nothingness, vanishes back into the same. After the miraculous appearance and disappearance of that torn leaf, I remember almost nothing of literature for several years. I was 6 or so when the ugly duckling aroused in me the melancholy of life. gave me to see the deep sadness which pervades all romance, beauty, and adventure. I laughed heartily at the old hen-bird's wise remark that the world extended past the next field and much further. I could perceive the humour of that. But when the ugly duckling at last flew away on his strong pinions, and when he met the swans and was accepted as an equal, then I felt sorrowful, agreeably sorrowful. It seemed to me that nothing could undo, atone for, the grief and humiliation of the false duckling's early youth. I brooded over the injustice of his misfortunes for days, and the swans who welcomed him struck me as proud, cold, and supercilious in their politeness. I've never read The Ugly Duckling since those days. It survives in my memory as a long and complex narrative, crowded with vague and mysterious allusions, and wet with the tears of things. No novel, it was a prodigious novel for me, has more deliciously disturbed me. The pawnbroking establishment was transferred to my aunt, who conducted it for a long period. My father was ambitious. At the age of nearly 30, he did what to me has always seemed a marvellous thing. He decided to become a solicitor, and at the age of 34 he became one and set up in practice in the Potteries. This was something of a feat for a man of his age, poor and with a growing family. Although he actually read little, beyond the usual Dickens and George MacDonald, he had a curious detached interest in books, and his library was the largest of my youthful experience. I estimate it at 1,000 volumes, mostly dull or worthless, but all dignified. He had a passion for filling his offspring with information, at small trouble to himself. When any point of dispute arose, he would say, "Luke it up." We looked it up. He secretly thought that his children were the best behaved and the most gifted in the district, but to our faces he seldom praised us, and never without grave reserves. When I won 20 guineas for a short story in a weekly paper, he said, "Well, it's better than a bat in the eye with a burnt stick." I took this for high laudation. In addition to being a disciplinarian, he loved to see others work. Never would he allow his boys to go out and play in the evening like other boys. He relentlessly, ruthlessly stimulated his children's ambitions, and his influence over us was immense because he was keenly interested in us. I grew up in an atmosphere of sustained effort, of grim sticking it, of silent endurance, of never being beaten by circumstance. I am now glad of it. At school, I was chiefly bored. I went to 3 schools. The first is not worth mentioning. Well, the Burslem Wesleyan Day School. The second, the Burslem Endowed School, is hardly worth mentioning. The headmaster introduced the horizontal bar, single stick, bronze medals — I lost mine for arithmetic — and marching into school and out of school to a tune of his own playing on a harmonium. The third, Newcastle Middle School, was better. The school had a good reputation, doubtless deserved, according to contemporary standards. I despised it for a strange reason, namely, because, well aware that I knew nothing, I nevertheless rose with extraordinary rapidity to the top of the school. I thought, if I am captain of this school, what a rotten school it must be, and what rotters must be the other boys. I left school at 16 in 1883.
From Clayhanger. The various agencies which society has placed at the disposal of a parent had been at work on Edwin in one way or another for at least a decade, in order to equip him for just this very day when he should step into the world. The moment must therefore be regarded as dramatic, the first crucial moment of an experiment long and elaborately prepared. Knowledge was, admittedly, the armour and the weapon of one about to try conclusions with the world, and many people for many years had been engaged in providing Edwin with knowledge. He had received, in fact, a good education, or even, as some said, a thoroughly sound education. Assuredly as complete an equipment of knowledge as could be obtained in the county. for the curriculum of the Oldcastle High School was less in accord with common sense than that of the middle school. He knew, however, nothing of natural history, and in particular of himself, and of the mechanism of the body and mind through which his soul had to express and fulfill itself. Not one word of information about either physiology or psychology had ever been breathed to him, nor had it ever occurred to anyone around him that such information was needful. And as no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries which he carried about with him inside that fair skin of his, so no one had tried to explain to him the mysteries by which he was hemmed in, either mystically through religion or rationally through philosophy. Never in chapel or at Sunday school had a difficulty been genuinely faced. And as for philosophy, he had not the slightest conception of what it meant. He imagined that a philosopher was one who made the best of a bad job, and he had never heard the word used in any other sense. He had great potential intellectual curiosity, but nobody had thought to stimulate it by even casually telling him that the finest minds of humanity had been trying to systemize the mysteries for quite 25 centuries. Of physical science, he had been taught nothing, save a grotesque perversion to the effect that gravity was a force which drew things towards the center of the earth. In the matter of chemistry, it had been practically demonstrated to him scores of times, so that he should never forget this grand basic truth, that sodium and potassium may be relied upon to fizz flamingly about on a surface of water. Of geology, he was perfectly ignorant, though he lived in a district whose whole livelihood depended on the scientific use of geological knowledge. And as he had acquired absolutely nothing about political economy or about logic, and was therefore at the mercy of the first agreeable sophistry that might take his fancy by storm, his unfitness to commence the business of being a citizen almost reached perfection.
After leaving school, I at once sat for the London matric and passed. 2 or 3 years later, I sat for the London LLB Intermediate. 3 subjects, you had to pass in all of them. I failed in all of them. I sat again and failed in one of them. This commie tragedy finished my education. School, I admit, had taught me something more valuable than grammar and geography. It taught me how to keep to a timetable, and to be in a certain place at a certain hour, and to complete more or less a certain task by a certain hour, and no nonsense permitted. The seed of this lesson did not fall on stony ground. I grew more and more addicted to the organization of my time. The consequence was that I have acquired an unmerited reputation for being a hard worker. I am not a hard worker, I am merely an organized worker. As regards my self-education, as distinguished from the education imposed on me, it began feebly at the age of 21, when I quitted the romance of the Potteries for the prose of London. I learned to speak German, and in course of time lost this pleasing faculty through disuse of it. I learned to read Italian, and lost this faculty too. French I acquired permanently. 4 or 5 years in the office of a London lawyer's enabled me to learn a bit about human nature, and 4 or 5 years in weekly journalism forced me to learn how to capture by words the attention of the average man, a personage, let me say, whom I deeply respect. But what more than anything else helped me to help myself in education was the frequenting of artists in other arts. Painters, designers, sculptors, musicians. These friends and acquaintances unconsciously indicated to me other ways of seeing and feeling than the ways employed in literature. How did I learn to write? I didn't. I am still learning to write, and by the only method. You learn to write by writing, and writing, and writing. But you must take each word by itself, examining it as you would examine a criminal, and by avoiding ready-made phrases. There is no harder work than learning to write. It is so hard that it prevents general education in the customary sense of the term. But the novelist, who has to deal with everything in life, has a great privilege. He is permitted to have no exact knowledge of anything in life, except his craft, and not always that.